Hello, and welcome to another session on Microsoft Azure Stack. My name is Mark Grimes. I will be presenting this session. I've created another shortcut for you at aka.ms/azurestack/templates, which will take you to the GitHub repository where there are plenty of Azure Stack templates that you can begin your journey in learning how to create and deploy Azure Stack templates. It's a really fantastic resource. You'll want to download those, have them available in your workstation, and practice and learn by looking at them. For our agenda, we're going to have an overview about the templates. We'll talk about Azure Resource Manager concepts, or ARM, about how the APIs, the resource groups, and resource tags work. We'll talk about authoring ARM templates for format, syntax, and parameters. And then finally, taking a look at setting up your environment for using tools like Visual Studio and PowerShell to create and deploy templates. Throughout this presentation, you'll see the word Azure because since we have consistency with Azure and Azure Stack, these concepts for building and deploying templates are very similar. So we have the same discussion with our Azure customers. And in the Azure Stack administration, when you think about this, once you've set up the environment with offers, plans, quotas, all the resource providers, and marketplace items, when the user then creates a user or tenant subscription, that world pretty much is just like an Azure subscription would be. So again, the concepts apply. So there's two sides of the coin of this. A would be if you were someone who was helping to administer or helping your customer inside that tenant subscription to create, deploy templates within that, or as I've mentioned in other sessions, as an Azure Stack operator, you could help simplify their lives and make pre-made templates that you populate in the marketplace, and we'll discuss that in the marketplace presentation. So let's start off with ARM concepts here. So Azure Resource Manager, or ARM, is a declarative template-driven approach. With Resource Manager, you can create a simple template file in JSON format that defines deployment and configuration of your application. And with this, we can deploy multiple resources at the same time. We can have a central endpoint to deploy models for cloud service sources, and also manage lifetime and global properties of cloud services using ARM. Within an ARM template, you define the infrastructure for your application, how to configure that infrastructure, and how to publish your app code to that infrastructure. So again, whether this is in the Azure Stack operator side, or if you're making marketplace templates or assisting your customer in the tenant space, these are all useful concepts. So with Azure Resource Manager, first of all, we have to describe where the resource inventory is, what we're going to have as far as component relationships. So think of the example of a virtual machine. A virtual machine isn't just a single object in Azure or Azure Stack. It has other relationships with things like a network interface card, IP addresses, maybe load balancers, and other things. How we're going to describe it with things like tags and links and groups. We'll talk more about those later. When we're going to provision, now in Azure Stack, currently we only have and support a single region, and in the future that will likely change. But when we provision in Azure Stack, we are just provisioning to the stamp or the single Azure Stack integrated system. So it's going to be that region which you define. Some customers I've worked with actually have multiple stamps in multiple places. However, each of them are separate and independent endpoints, and that is where you would deploy it to. But if you're doing this in Azure, of course, we can have it go across multiple regions as well. And another interesting idea is that in a hybrid application, we could have one template that could deploy to one or more Azure Stack stamps and also have components deployed in Azure. So that's getting a little bit more complex and beyond the topic of conversation here, but helps you to imagine the possibilities in hybrid applications. Provision across resources and how with in-service and in-guest. So What that means is we could have the Azure resources deployed, like in the example I talked about in the virtual machine, but then the template could also, or in the PowerShell, and more so in particular, we could have things in the guest OS deployed. So the ARM template may use something like an extension that allows custom script extension, and then that extension now has abilities to work inside of that virtual machine to do things like promoting the virtual machine to a domain controller or adding features or roles to that server. With the ARM templates, we can control who can access. So in other sessions, we've talked about role-based access control. We can set that up in the template. What kind of changes? If we're going to do a role-based access control, where are we going to deploy this to the subscription, to the resource group? Are we going to put locks on there to prevent accidental deletion or to only provide read-only access to resources? So with ARM, we can easily deploy, manage, and monitor all the resources for your solutions. And what we want to do is create repeatable deployments of solutions throughout the development lifecycle, and then have confidence your resources are deployed in a consistent state. We want to be able to manage your infrastructure through declarative templates rather than scripts. A lot of administrators we talk with, they're used to PowerShell or they're used to command line or whatever scripting language they like. But when you look at everything that's deployed in Azure and everything that's deployed in Azure Stack, everything ultimately happens through REST API, and that's beyond most administrators' capabilities. But if they are proficient at it, let them run with that. That's fine. But at the end of the day, everything is deployed and expressed as an ARM template. And a lot of resources are out there. So this is a very fundamental skill that both you and the people you work with need to know and understand well. Because then you don't have to reinvent the wheel, because a lot of these patterns have been defined, as we showed in the initial shortcut for the GitHub repository for Azure Stack templates. And I do want to emphasize a point about that. There are quick start templates both for Azure and Azure Stack. The ones for Azure Stack are very specific to the APIs because while we try to have as much consistency as possible, there will be some API differences between something like a network resource provider versus virtual machine resource provider versus app services. So always use the Azure Stack quick start templates as a place to start with. Also, with Azure Resource Manager, we can have dependencies between resources, and we'll talk more about those a little bit later. So all the deployment and management and provisioning happens, as we mentioned, through REST API. And again, if you're in the management portal or in the user portal and you're deploying things, it makes calls down in the bottom layers through REST API. Likewise, so does PowerShell, so does XPlat, which stands for Cross-Platform CLI or Command Line Interface. The ARM templates ultimately communicate that way as well. Each mechanism uses ARM API. And in one extreme example, just to talk about possibilities, I haven't seen a lot of customers do this, but one interesting organization I work with, they had a custom portal in Azure, and everything was API driven in the background. So they had a single portal that their customers in Azure could log into, and pretty much it was like a menu choice of options. They could say small, medium, and large. I want this type of machine. I want this type of storage account. I want load balance, et cetera, and then they would select that. And then when they went to Azure Stack, which they integrated in as a hybrid option, they did the same thing. So they were very sophisticated at using the REST APIs, and the REST APIs can actually call ARM templates as well. So they can leverage those things that have already been built and use the REST API calls in this very, very customized portal. But again, that's beyond what most people do, but just possibilities that can be considered. Okay. Resource providers. So as an Azure Stack administrator, these are the capabilities you have to provide. In the public Azure, they're all there, but they may not be enabled. So as a owner in a subscription, whenever you deploy anything, those resource providers are automatically enabled. And there is a PowerShell script. You can do a Bing search for that in Azure Stack to enable all resource providers. Or again, if administrator in a subscription is the owner, and whenever they fire up something, it will light up the storage resource provider or the virtual machine resource provider or whatever. But essentially, it's just a service that supplies the resources you can deploy and manage through Resource Manager. As in another example, if you want to deploy an Azure Key Vault for storing keys and secrets, you work with the Microsoft Key Vault resource provider. Now in Azure Stack, that one happens to be enabled by default, and it's there. But if the customer or your tenant said, we would like to have app services, please, if you never installed that resource provider, those capabilities are not there. Now, one important note that you need to know is that some things act as a resource provider. So an example in particular, like SQL, MySQL, and app services, those are a resource provider which you as an Azure Stack administrator or operator control, manage, maintain, update, patch, all that. There are other capabilities which you can add, which are called templated solutions. So in those templated solutions, you would get those from the marketplace, which we'll talk about later. And then you would enable those. And when the customer deploys those, it would deploy that entire thing into their user subscription. So as an example, if we deploy a resource provider for SQL in Azure Stack, that is basically kind of like a pass-through agent. There's a SQL server that would be deployed and run on either the Azure Stack integrated system or off the stamp. And when a user provisions a database, it creates a virtual server and a virtual database. But they don't have to patch and update it, but you as the provider do. But if we had a templated solution for a SQL server, maybe because there's more things and capabilities, which there are, in a full-blown SQL server versus the resource provider. But if the customer or the tenant/user deploys that templated solution, they now kind of own it. We call that their pet versus managing cattle, right? So every server is their own pet. They have to patch it, update it. They have full responsibilities. So just want to clarify that difference, that the resource providers on the operator side are more of the responsibility of the Azure Stack operator versus templated solutions, which are not resource providers, but can provide similar capability, like, for example, Kubernetes, but it's a templated solution and you're building those things in the virtual machines in the user space. So again, a little bit more about REST API, things that ARM uses it to manage resources. We've talked about some of these, but additional items would be policies, which include assignments and definitions, the resource groups, template deployments, and all the tenants. So again, you are responsible for making sure the requests are secure. And one of the best ways to do that is to use service principles. Let's bring this up a little bit, up the stack of talking about resource groups and the hierarchies. So in both Azure and Azure Stack, we have resource groups. And when you think about a subscription itself is really a container that has properties on it for deploying things. But ultimately, everything within a subscription must go into a resource group. I always ask people, why do we create resource groups if they've been in the cloud environment? Sometimes they know, sometimes they don't. But I use a parallel example to Active Directory. Why do we have organizational units? Well, in Active Directory, organizational units have two purposes: delegate administration and group policies. Well, we don't have group policies in the cloud, but we do have delegation of administration. So resource groups is a way that we can delegate rights with RBAC. So in a previous session, we talked about RBAC, that we can assign rights at the entire subscription scope, per resource group scope, or per resource as we see inside this resource group here, with a database and a storage account and a web app and a virtual machine. Okay. So that's one thing. But really the better answer is resource groups are a deployment methodology. We think about similar types of things that we want to do and think about the workload or the application that we want to deploy. And particularly in pre-production environments, this is very handy. Give you a real-world example. I've had an insurance customer who really did this in a great way, that they had a completely automated environment. They're kind of my poster child. But what they did was, whenever someone in the development team said, may I please have access to the subscription, their script would grant that user or that team access to a resource group, which then becomes their sandbox, which then they deploy things. And then when they're done, they could just kill the resource group, or the person writing the script could kill the resource group. And everything was cleaned up and wiped away very nicely. As opposed to, in this picture here, if I would go in and just delete the virtual machine, well, that's going to leave some garbage behind. There are things that are attached to it and used, because the virtual machine requires a NIC and it requires a storage account. So while we would kill the virtual machine, we may not kill the public IP address, we may not kill the storage account. But if we were in dev test, pre-prod, and we're done with it, we delete the resource group, everything's nice and clean. Note on the third bullet too, it says resource groups can span regions. Not an issue in Azure Stack right now because a single region. But again, in Azure, if you're doing this, you could. So this is a comparison in the resource group lifecycle. And the difference is, would you have one resource group that contains a whole bunch of things, or would we have a resource group per item, or maybe a resource group per like items? So for example, in the bottom right hand corner, you could have a resource group that has all the storage accounts, not just one. But the question is, should it be in the same resource group or separate ones? And as we mentioned before, the question you should ask, do they share a common lifecycle and method of management? So again, for the delegation, that's a concern and an issue that you want to think about. And also the deployment methodology for those applications. It's really, really rare. I would almost never recommend that we have a resource group per object. I can't even think of a great example. There probably is one out there. But I would not normally do that. Also, in the past, many, many moons ago, when I first started Azure, I kind of would think to myself, well, let's put all the network resources together inside a group. And because the network team, they're kind of picky. They like to control their stuff. But then I kind of realized I don't really necessarily need to do that so much. It may make them feel good that they've got their container and no one else can see it or get inside. But all I have to do is apply those rights for network administration. And again, in Azure Stack, I'd have to make a custom RBAC role to do that. But I could, in a subscription, I could make a custom role-based access control role just for network at the subscription. And then only the network people could have ownership or contributor rights to it. But then we could also grant across the subscription or per resource group as they're deployed, the required rights for the person that's building that virtual machine that needs to read the subnet information inside that resource group. So the deployment lifecycle really is ultimately it. And as we described in the example of an application with lots of tiers, that's probably the best way to do it. So a couple other things here about organizational concepts. Again, resource groups are tightly coupled to a container of resources, Azure Stack or Azure resources. They follow the RBAC rules as a scope where we can apply it. Resources in Azure Stack and in Azure, you can only deploy them to one resource group, and I cannot be a member of more than one. Some applications may be able to leverage resource groups with tags for billing controls, but you'll have to check with your software vendor if that's supported in Azure Stack or not. In Azure, some do. We can put resource tags onto Azure Stack, which are essentially metadata. They're name value pairs that we can assign. So a lot of people may use in the name of the resources little bits and pieces to define how to name something, but maybe we can't fit everything in there, so we can use a tag that will tell a little bit more information. As an example, we could have an environment tag. Then the values could be production, dev test, QA, staging. And then when we deploy things, depending on where we're going to put it, that tag, and then that tag could actually be used, and we'll show this a little bit later on, to concatenate for some other variables or parameters as a kind of a combined expression, which is pretty cool. But per resource, just like in Azure Stack, we can have up to 15 tags, but the tags cannot be multi-valued. But at the end of the day, they're just defined by the user or by whoever in the subscription wants to have governance over those. So anything else here? I think we've covered most of this. So the only additional point here is that we can pre-create these if you want. So you could just create a bunch of tags and then use and leverage them if you want. Or using an ARM template, it can be part of the ARM template itself in doing this. One of the things from a management portal perspective, which is kind of nice, and I've done this, just an example, in my subscriptions where I do testing for various customers, I can put a tag for the customer name in my subscription. And then if I go to tags in the left-hand side, the menu for the administrator portal, I can actually click on Mark Grimes Company, and it will then show me every tag that exists. Another thing that is not on the slide, but I think is really important to note too, we can use ARM policies to do an audit of do tags exist. So maybe later on down the road, we didn't use tags at first, but later on down the road, we said, we think we really want to have tags. Moving forward, we're going to have a tag for everything being deployed, but we need to go back and kind of retro see if anything else missed it. So we could apply a policy for the entire subscription saying, does tag exist? If not, then do that. So you can get some interesting logic to create tags, audit tags, and then make them happen afterward. So next we're going to talk about authoring ARM templates. So again, we said templates are a declarative model based on specification of resources. They're idempotent. This is a word you'll never use outside of Azure, at least I sure haven't. Idempotent means if we have a template and you run it, and my insurance company did this, they had a script that deployed their entire Azure environment every single night. And it could run every night because if no changes happened, nothing happened. But if Mark says, hey, I need a resource group for my sandbox, that would be the only thing that happens. So only the changes that happen will be deployed. So that's what idempotent means. We have consistent deployment. Again, we can help with our consistency by using the GitHub quick start templates and starting with those. ARM templates should be considered just like code, that it should be source filed and checked in, and treat it like that because it creates your company's assets. And we'll talk about parameterized input and output coming up here. This is the simplest structure in Elements. So you reference a schema, talk about that. Content version, parameters, variables, resources, and outputs, and we'll break all those down. This is from the documentation, which just gives a little bit more definition, and you see some of these things are required, like the schema, the content version, and the resource that's going to be deployed, but the other things are not. So parameters and variables aren't required, but they're pretty darn useful and helpful. Depending on one versus the other, we'll talk about that, why you would use a parameter versus a variable. And outputs are values that return after deployment, and again, you may never need those, but they're there if you do. So the basic syntax of JSON or JavaScript object notation, we have expressions which are enclosed with brackets. They're evaluated when the template is deployed, and they can appear anywhere in the JSON string, and they always return another JSON value. But note the note here, if you need to use a literal string that starts with a bracket, you must use two brackets. How about that? Parameters. Parameters specify which values you can input when deploying resources, and able to customize deployment, providing values tailored for a particular environment such as dev, test, or production. Again, these are optional, but we can put these in here. So in this example at the bottom of the screen, we have default values of optional value parameter, and then an optional array of allowed values for the parameters that we can define. So here's another example. I like this one. So in this case, looks like maybe it's an web app or app service type thing we're doing here. So it says hosting plans SKU. So we have various allowed values, free, shared, basic, standard, premium, but the default is free. So in the template, when you run it, it's going to default to free. You would have a drop-down list option for the parameters, free, shared, basic, standard, premium, and then those could be selected. So variables, unlike a parameter where parameters, you can have multiple values and then select from a variable says, I want it to be this, or I want it to be that. I know it's always going to be that, and it's not going to ever be this. So I can simply define those. And if you notice in the bottom part of the screen, it's kind of interesting. You can use different things to make it a combination. So in this case, we have a concat function, which takes the name parameters username and the password, and it uses that for a connection string. So you can concatenate or kind of combine various other parameters or other variables in there to make one really cool, interesting variable. Here's another example. Variables used to create an IaaS machine. And resources, so the resource section of the template, this is where we define the resources deployed or updated. In this case, it's a Microsoft.web hosting plan, or it could be a virtual machine, or it could be network card or storage account, all sorts of things. Okay. And in this one is showing you a little bit more examples. So we can have in the resources, have an array of the resources to deploy. So in this case, they have a first and a second and a third child that we could have in the resources property. And then as we mentioned, we can have outputs. So you can specify values that are returned from deployment. So for example, you could return the URI to access a deployed resource. And you can have that output displayed in your PowerShell, and or it will show sometimes in the portal as well. So in here, this is a specific example of a value returned in the output sections. So in this one, we have the site URI, and it takes the value, it concatenates HTTP, whack whack, and then it references the resource ID for the Microsoft websites, plus the parameters of the site name and actually the host name of that as well. ARM schemas. So at the top, we said this was one of those things that is required. And the three main ways to explore the schema and properties available. You can look at published schema files, you can look at examples, and JSON responses from the REST APIs. So this is really important to get right, because if you have the wrong schema value, your template's going to fail. And again, one of the best ways to ensure you get this right is to use the quick start templates. And there's some other options we'll look at a little bit later if you're going to do hybrid deployments and also using APIs. So expressions and functions will extend the JSON available in the template, and you can take values, and we've been talking about these already, that are not strict literal values, but they are combinations of things. And it shows a little bit in the screen, but if you can't see red and green, I apologize, you won't be able to see the green. But in the username and password, there's a green bracket, and inside that we concatenate the parameters of the username and the password. And likewise at the bottom of the screen, you concatenate a base64 variable, username and password. And this is calculated inside of the variable first, and then it's going to return a value. We can also link ARM templates. In the picture before, where we had the resource group but contained everything, and then we had separate different Azure resources or Azure Stack resources in their own resource group. And again, we said that's not a desired thing, but you could have templates of different things. So in the example we talked before about having a 3-tiered application, maybe each tier goes into its own resource group. So front end, middle, back end tier. We like those things to be kind of grouped in those 3 tiers. So each of those could be in their own resource group, and maybe they have other things that are needed, but we don't necessarily want to deploy with those. But at deployment time, maybe there's a backend database that we want to link in there. So we can have one template linked to another, and then you can therefore decompose your deployment instead of targeted purpose-specific templates in the example I just described. You can pass parameters from a main template to a link, and then those parameters can then directly map to parameters or variables exposed by calling the template. And then also you can use variables to link templates together. The link template can also pass an output variable back to the source template, enabling a two-way data exchange between templates. And in this example, it uses the parameter property to specify a parameter value directly. And when we create a link between 2 templates, we add a deployment resource within the main template that points to the link template. We set the template link property to the URI of the link template. And then in the middle of the right-hand side, we see the template link URI references HTTPS contoso.com, Azure Templates, new storage account.json. And then optionally, we can provide parameter values for the link template, either by specifying the values directly in the template or by linking to a parameter file. And in this example here, we see at the lower right hand of the picture, the parameters has the value for the storage account name in there. Requirements for linking to a template: the resource manager service cannot access a local file or a file that's only available on your local network. So therefore, we have to use a URI, and that is either HTTP or HTTPS. And this picture is pretty typical, where you could have a storage account and keep those templates there. Linking to a parameter file. So we'll talk a little bit later about using Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. And by default, when you fire up a new template in there, it will make a parameter file for you, which is really nice. You can keep all the variables in there. And it's the same concept here in the lower right-hand side. As we mentioned, you have a parameters link, and in this case, it points to URI, HTTP, or HTTPS. And it could either be out on a website or it could be in a storage account. Defining dependencies in ARM templates. So sometimes before you deploy one thing, you need to make sure something else is there in advance. So we can define dependencies between resources. We can use the depends on property and the resource property. So the dependencies between resources are evaluated, and then the resources are deployed in their dependent order. So in this example here, we have the name of the resource, the type, the API version, location, and then tags, name value pairs for resource tagging. And then it says depends on, and then in this case, in the brackets, we have an array of related resource names. And then that dependency is now created in the ARM template. So why do we use the depends on property? So it provides the ability to find dependencies for a resource. Dependency, as we mentioned about having a backend database successfully provisioned for a given VM, or multiple nodes in a cluster to be installed before deploying a VM. And it will evaluate the dependencies between resources, so resources are deployed in their dependent order. Not applicable use cases. So documenting how resources are interconnected and risking negative performance impact where you may inadvertently distract the deployment engine from using parallelism where it might have otherwise. Because if we don't have the depends on, there may be parallelism. In other words, multiple things deployed at the same time, which is one of the benefits of templates that can help to speed up the deployment. Property resources. The resources property specifically allows you to specify child resources that are related to the resource being defined. But child resources can only be defined 5 levels deep. And note, if you need the child resource to be deployed after the parent resource, you must explicitly state that dependency within the depends on property. So next, let's take a look at setting up your ARM template authoring environment. Our two favorite tools, of course, are Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. And Visual Studio Code is a free download. And if you happen to have licenses for Visual Studio, you'll get a little bit richer editing. But actually, Visual Studio Code's pretty darn nice. And you see it looks pretty much the same. It's just not going to be used for complex development to the same degree and possibilities that we can do with Visual Studio. So you can go to visualstudio.com to get access to Visual Studio Code and get that on your workstation. If you wanted to, you could use any text editor. You also can use what I've used in the past before using Visual Studio Code is PowerShell ISE. Could use PowerShell, but the nice thing about PowerShell ISE on your workstation is it gives you 3 windows. The left quadrant or third has a text file area where you can save your scripts. So as I'm building these ARM templates out, I can save them inside the PowerShell ISE. So that's another way we can look at and display these. And there's various other editors too you can do. But these two, as you see, they're color-coded. They have IntelliSense. They're really, really nice. So in preparing your environment, there is a documentation. I did not have a shortcut for it. I should. But if you just do a search on Bing for Azure Stack Visual Studio setup, I'm pretty sure that will get you the article, and it will tell you how to install and configure. Actually, if you're doing Visual Studio Code, put that in your search. And it will give you step-by-steps how to get that set up and to configure it properly. If you have Visual Studio already, you want to make sure you have the latest version of the Azure SDK installed and configured as well. So then you go in and you make a new project. And this is showing the Azure SDK for .NET. I believe in the, if I'm doing Azure Stack, it's a resource manager option in there you select, and then you can start building templates that way. There we go. This is what I was looking for. So in the Azure Resource Group projects, so in the cloud, this is the option you would select in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, and that's where you begin. And once you do that, you get a nice little GUI box that lets you kind of just select, pick, and choose. It doesn't have everything in it, but it has kind of the core things that you're most likely going to deploy, you know, for virtual machines and network components, storage accounts, web apps. And you literally just kind of select and click, and it will build out the ARM template for you. Then also, once we're done, we have the Solution Explorer. In this case, we're looking at an Azure Resource Group. And again, this could be connected to Azure Stack in the same way. In the right-hand side, we see the scripts to deploy the Azure Resource Group for the PowerShell, as well as templates. In this case, we have a website SQL database join and also the parameters file. And it's also got the easy copy tool, probably to help move files much more efficiently in there. So with Visual Studio, with Resource Manager, so as we highlighted, there's a deploy.azureresourcegroup.ps1 file, and that's what invokes the PowerShell commands to deploy the Azure Resource Manager template. And again, there's multiple ways to deploy that template. You could use the PowerShell, you could use Azure CLI, you could use REST API if you wanted to, but PowerShell for Windows folks is usually the most comfortable and familiar. And then also we talked about the website SQL database join that builds the infrastructure there. Now, if we wanted to customize this, so we have this all built, we could look at the JSON outline inside of Visual Studio, and in this case, we're looking at the SQL Server, and we can give tools to edit and configure that to make it much easier. Again, so I don't have to sit there and type out all this code so much. We have some little GUI interface in there. So when I select on the left-hand side in the website, on the right-hand side, we actually see the JSON file, and whatever I select on, you notice the light blue highlights. It highlights that section. So everything that's expressed for the website, and we see the API version, name, type, location, depends on, tags, properties, etc., will be highlighted. And likewise, if I'd click SQL Server, I'd see all the aspects of that as well. So for the hybrid cloud experience, we want to leverage API profiles, which these are pretty cool. So this is a set of namespaces and API versions. So as an example, if I was going to deploy something that had multiple subcomponents, so that's something, let's just use an example, virtual machine, and we're going to have components as a hybrid application. Some things are going to be in Azure, some are going to be in Azure Stack. By doing the profile, it allows that profile basically adjust for all the various different API versions for all the various components. So I don't have to go through and individually update all the components. All I have to do is make sure I have the correct API version that covers all the various components underneath it. And that will make my deployment much, much easier in a hybrid environment. And again, in Bing, if you search for Azure API profiles, there's great documentation to help you out on this. So taking the prior example a little bit further, we want to add a new resource. So we're going to customize it, and all we have to do in Visual Studio is just right click and say add a new resource, and then we can deploy something like a storage account to it. And the beauty of this also that I like, I'll make a little different example because I've seen this. If I would have selected virtual machine and I already had a storage account, and since a virtual machine is going to need a storage account, it will recognize that. It will say, oh, do you want to use this storage account? Or it will give you a drop-down list if you had multiple storage accounts in that code. So that's pretty neat. And then in this part here, notice that you not only get a resource added, but also a parameter for the type of storage account and a variable for the name of the storage account. So again, we would get this in Visual Studio, but we can go in and change these values and control it. And think about this as an example for a solution template in the Marketplace template, which we'll have another session on that. We could help the users in the user subscriptions if we built these templates and we deployed these in the Marketplace. We could provide these options, small, medium, large, or whatever type of values we want to have for the storage accounts. And then we could take that another step further, and we don't have any session to really go deep into Azure Policies, but if you look about Azure Policies, it basically kind of slaps their hand and says, well, you can't use these other things. So while in this Resource Manager template, we could say small, medium, large, we could also put an Azure Resource Manager policy that says you can never, ever use an extra small or extra large or double extra large. That's a nice way, again, controlling what people might want to or try to deploy in their environment if you have people that live like it's a Wild West. So in this, we're just looking at some of the IntelliSense of here. So we have a hosting plan and number of workers for worker roles, and it just pops up those values. So again, another value of using the Visual Studio, and even Visual Studio for Code will give you that. And then finally, inside of Visual Studio, either flavor you have, we can deploy this. Now in this case, it's showing the Microsoft account, but we would have this referencing our Azure Stack and the subscription, then Azure that's tied to the Azure Stack, and we could deploy it into Azure Stack as well. Okay. And just kind of walking through it, we select the resource group because, as we know, everything has to be deployed. And once we're connected to that Azure Stack environment, it will show the available resource groups that we have to deploy. And then you can change, so the parameters that we had defined in the ARM template, you can edit these parameters in a little pop-up box and just change them there as well. and then save it. So on the deploy to Azure, choose the deployed button and Azure or Azure Stack, and then you'll see the progress in the deployment output window, and it may take a few minutes to complete, depending on the configuration and how complex it is. And then if you have any other particular passwords, like in this case, example of a database administrator, you would have to enter that as well. And then finally, of course, you could go into Azure Stack or Azure and actually see the resources deployed. And if you need to redeploy your project, you make changes, want to redeploy, you can choose the existing resource group directly from the Azure Resource Group on the menu and choose deploy, and then choose the resource group you just deployed to. Pretty simple. So that's Visual Studio using the ARM templates. We're going to now talk a little bit about PowerShell, because that's one of our favorite tools. So in this case, here's the new -Azure ARM resource group deployment. We specify the resource group name, and then we have the template file, which in this case, is the Azure deploy.json. And note, so as we mentioned, you got to specify the resource group. You use the template URI parameter to specify a non-local URI for the template, and then -mode parameter to either incremental or complete. So that, by default, it's incremental. If you have complete, if you change that, it would totally rewrite and overwrite. So incremental is just the changes, right, that we like for item potency. Dynamic template parameters. So just some other examples here in using this. So we have the server name, database name, administrator login. And in this example, it looks like there's dirt on the screen, but actually in each line there's a little hash tick. So if you're doing PowerShell in the PowerShell editor or in Visual Studio, if you do carriage returns, that's a way to kind of make it not go in a big long line, but to separate out those. So if you do a carriage return, but it's supposed to be one line and all those things are included, you have to have that little hash tick there. So the point they're making here also is if you are in Visual Studio or if you are in PowerShell ISE and or even just in PowerShell, you can cycle through all the available parameters by doing a plus sign or a minus sign and pressing the tab key, which is pretty cool. So then it will dynamically fetch the information and then add the parameters to the command dynamically. And then deploying the template. So again, what to watch out for if the template has a parameter with a name that matches one of the parameters in the command to deploy the template, such as including resource group name in your template with the same as the resource group name parameter, you're going to be prompted to provide a parameter with a postfix from template, such as resource group name from template. In other words, don't use the same name. So to avoid the confusion, don't name parameters with the same name as parameters used for deployment options. It will pretty much choke on you. The command from deploying ultimately returns the message and the resources. So this is an example here of what you would see in the PowerShell interface. So we have a deployment that succeeded, the mode was incremental, and these are the things that are created inside of it. And finally, let's talk about some ARM template troubleshooting. Debugging. So template validation, you can use add-ons into Visual Studio like JSON lint and with an atom and other things. There is a test-Azure resource group template commandlet you can use. You can also look at resource group logging in the events. In the PowerShell, you can do get-Azure resource group log. In Azure CLI, that's actually the old command. It's probably just AZ group log show now, but it's Azure group log show. And in Azure Stack, it actually would be correct. In Azure, they're using the AZ commands now. We'd have to double check. You might want to double check on the newest version if that's been changed. in Azure Stack. There's also the Azure REST API Explorer. That URL will probably not work in Azure Stack, but there is the Explorer inside the menu in Azure Stack. And essentially, that lets you see all resources for within your environment. You can expand out. It's pretty cool. Other things for debugging the templates. So what do I do? We have error message and deployment output, test the expressions and deployment outputs. We have activity logs. You can use a debug switch for either PowerShell or CLI, and it will show the entire REST conversation. Also, if you have custom scripts, there's VM extension logs. We have a link there for you. You can use a WA agent. Contains downloaded files and the std out log. There's a handler log, and also for custom script, there's a set of URIs for downloads that you can grab. Also, Stack Overflow is really good. That's kind of our current go-to, both internally and externally to Microsoft, as well as MSDN and Docs, of course. We also have a verbose switch that we can use that will give you more information. And in this case, we're looking at, as it was going on, what was happening during each step of the phase, from provisioning to the status, if it was successful or not. So that's always a good switch to run, just to check. Some common template errors. So globally unique names. And some resources are globally unique names, some are not. Storage accounts is one of those things that, absolutely is globally unique. Regex causing problems in names, so you have to make sure you conform to regex standards for lowercase numbers, dashes, etc. Storage account provisioning delays, so not as much in Azure Stack perhaps as in public Azure, but still could be a little delay on that. Case-sensitive URIs, so you just have to watch out for that when parameter values refer to URIs that are case-sensitive. Your JSON syntax, again, for quotes, brackets, parens, but that's a beauty about using Visual Studio because it will highlight those in red squiggly line. You'll see that. DSC, or desired state configuration errors. So again, there's local logs you can look at on the virtual machine. Location region conflicts. Well, in Azure Stack, that's not going to be an issue because we only have a single region. But again, in the public Azure, is something to watch out for as well. And then incremental deployments, artifact location empty or null. So we want to make sure we have a proper location in there. So there you have it, folks. Some information about Azure Stack and ORM templates, and applicable in Azure as well, which is good because hopefully you'll be doing hybrid deployments and applications that span across Azure and Azure Stack. My name is Mark Grimes. I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you very much.